Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I thought in War Thunder today we would have a look at one of the upcoming vehicles, the Ju-388. Now it isn't in the files yet, and neither are any of these other engineering vehicles as they're calling them, but I thought what we would do is go back to some of the general sources that I use, especially for German aircraft, and have a chat about what the Ju-388 is, and even though we have one coming to the event as a premium, there are other options when it comes to, standard tech tree versions, which is something I personally like to see when it comes to these types of premiums. So we're going to be reading from Warplanes of the Third Reich by William Green and the Ju-388 section, and afterwards I'll also talk about the different versions and what I personally would like to see in the game. So let's get started. With the failure of the Bomber B program and the fast-approaching obsolescence of much of the Luftwaffe's bomber, reconnaissance, and Zerstorer equipment, the provision in the minimum possible time of warplanes possessing very much higher operational ceilings and speeds assumed the utmost urgency. The Ju-388 offered both this desired performance increment and the possibility of achieving it quickly without serious disruption of existing production arrangements. Thus, the importance attached by the RLM to the Hubertus program, as the Ju-388 development had been dubbed, can be imagined. With the debut of the Ju-388, almost the last vestiges of the external appearance of the original Ju-88 had disappeared, yet the basic structure, progressively strengthened and modified, though it may have been during its production life, remained essentially unchanged. Initiated in September 1943, the Hubertus program called for the development of three basic variants of the Ju-388. The Ju-388J, High Altitude, Bad Weather Fighter, the Ju-388K, which was a High Altitude Bomber, and the Ju-388L, which was a High Altitude Photographic Reconnaissance Aircraft. Originally proposed to the Technischen Amt of the RLM as parallel developments of the Ju-188S and T, and in fact known in their original project form as the Ju-188J, K, and L respectively, the Ju-388s shared a common airframe with the Ju-188, and, in the case of the Ju-388K and L, an identical pressurized forward fuselage to that employed by the Ju-188S and also T. Prototypes of all three basic models of the Ju-388 were ordered, these utilizing for the most part standard Ju-188 components, priority being given to the reconnaissance model, and whereas the original project studies had envisaged the use of UMO 213E1 engines, the uncertainty of adequate supplies of this power plant resulted in a decision to standardize on the turbo-supercharged BMW 801TJ for the initial series of all three versions, supplanting the air-cooled radial with the UMO as and when the supply situation improved. So the Ju-388L series. The first example of the Ju-388 was the prototype for the long-range reconnaissance version that designated Ju-388LV1 and completed late in 1943. It was rebuilt at Dessau from the Ju-188T1 airframe. Successful trials at the Erprobungsstelle Reichlin resulted in instructions being issued to the Allgemeine Transportanlagen, the GmbH ATG, at Mersburg, near Leipzig, for the conversion of 10 Ju-88S1 airframes as pre-production Ju-388L-0 reconnaissance aircraft. The first of these conversions was accepted by the Luftwaffe in August 1944, by which time preparations for the series production of the Ju-388L-1 at Mersburg were virtually complete. It had been planned from the outset that all versions of the Ju-388 should feature the MG131Z FA-15 remotely controlled tail barbette, which, mounting a vertically disposed pair of 13mm machine guns, was being tested by the Ju-188C-0, but teething problems had delayed Luftwaffe acceptance of the barbette. The barbette was intended to provide the sole defensive armament of the Ju-388L, but its non-availability for installation in the pre-production Ju-388L-0 necessitated the 10 examples of this version being fitted with the so-called Waffentruppen WT-81Z prior to delivery to the Erprobungskommando DIW-388, formed to undertake service evaluation. The Waffentruppen, or the weapon drop, comprised a teardrop-shaped ventral housing for two fixed aft firing 7.9mm. MG-81 machine guns, which were intended more as a deterrent to pursuing interceptors rather than a serious means of defense, as the speed and altitude at which the Ju-388L was intended to operate were expected to endow the aircraft with a measure of immunity from interception. The production Ju-388L1 differed from the pre-production L-0 in several respects. The wooden three-blade air screws were replaced by VDM Dural four-bladers. The FUG-270 Neptune tail warning radar was introduced, and the large wooden ventral pannier featured by the parallel Ju-388K bomber was adopted to accommodate both cameras and a jettisonable auxiliary fuel tank. Production deliveries of the Ju-388L-1 commenced in October 1944 from Mersburg, and in the following month deliveries also began from the Weser Flugzeugbau GmbH at Bremen. Although most of the teething troubles suffered by the FA-15 tail barbette had been eliminated by the time deliveries of the Ju-388L1 began, service trials revealed that at high speeds the angle adopted by the guns did not necessarily correspond with the with that desired by the gunner peering through the PVE-11 periscope sights. Consequently, forward maintenance units decided to supplement the twin barbette guns with a third 13mm MG131 firing aft above the fuselage from the starboard rear of the cockpit glazing, a fourth member being added to the crew complement. With this modification, the aircraft was designated the Ju-388L-1/B. The BMW 801TJ engines were each rated at 1800 horsepower for takeoff and had a combat rating of 1410 horsepower at 40,300 feet. Fuel was housed in two tanks in the wing center section, with a total capacity of 183 imperial gallons, a 93 imperial gallon tank in the port outer wing panel, and a 110 imperial tank in the starboard outer wing panel. The last mentioned tank being used only for climb to operational altitude and not being self-sealing. The fuselage housed one 370 and one 110 imperial gallon tank, but for nocturnal reconnaissance missions, internal capacity was reduced to 210 imperial gallons. A 198 imperial gallon jettisonable tank could be carried in the ventral pannier, which also housed two RB-2030, 50-30 or 75-30 cameras, which for night missions gave place to two NRB 35-25, 40-25 or 50-25 cameras. The Ju-388L3 differed from the Ju-388L1 in having UMO 213E1 engines with MW50 or methanol water injection and driving wooden VS-19 four-blade air screws. A total of 37 Ju-388L reconnaissance aircraft had been delivered from the Mersburg factory by the end of 1944. including 1 or 2 examples of the Ju-388L3, and Vesa produced 5 Ju-388L1s in November 1944, and a further 5 in December, when, owing to the reduced priority enjoyed by reconnaissance aircraft as a result of the rapidly deteriorating war situation, both plants abandoned further production. Several Ju-388Ls had been delivered to 3 Staffel der Verschutzverband (OBDL) late in 1944, but one of the Fernaufklärungsstaffen designated to receive this type completed conversion in time to become fully operational. Now we go on to the Ju-388J series. This is the one that we are actually getting into the game as this special vehicle. The development of the high-altitude night and all-weather fighter variant of the Ju-388 under the codename Studebaker, which sounds very similar to Studebaker, a legendary German pirate, was considered of the utmost importance by General Field Marshal Erhard Milch, the Generalluftzugmeister, who allocated the highest priority to expediting preparations for the quantity production of this warplane. There is some evidence to suggest that he was motivated in part by his prejudice against the HE-219, but there can be no doubt that during the early months of 1944, Studebaker bid fair to result in a highly effective combat aircraft, possessing an outstanding performance and mounting an extremely destructive offensive armament. Nevertheless, the instructions issued on May 25, 1944, by the Generalluftzugmeister Amt, calling for the immediate termination of the HE-219 production in favor of the Ju-388J and TAR-154, were undoubtedly premature. Within a few days, Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, having made a realistic appraisal of the development status of these aircraft, had countermanded Milch's order, but the importance attached to the Junkers Studebaker was to be gauged by the fact that even after the introduction of the Jäger Not program, the emergency fighter program, the further development of the Ju-388J was considered essential. Possessing an identical airframe to the bomber and reconnaissance variants of the Ju-388, the high-altitude night and all-weather Astoria prototype converted from a Ju-188T, the Ju-388V2, began its flight test program late in January 1944. It was equipped with the MG-131Z FA-15, a remotely controlled twin-gun tail barbette, which was intended as an item of equipment common to all Ju-388 variants. The Ju-388V2 carried FUGT-20 Liechtenstein SN2 with its Hirschgeweih, Stag's Antlers aerial array, and a forward-firing armament of 2 20mm MG151 cannons with 180 RPG and 2 30mm MK108 cannons with 110 RPG, which means rounds per gun, in a gun tray or Waffentropfen, mounted asymmetrically beneath the port side of the fuselage center section. The pressure cabin, which provided accommodation for a pilot, 2 observers, and a radio operator, was designed to maintain a pressurized differential of 3.7 pounds per square inch, and the cabin roof was double-glazed, partly with armor glass and partly with plexiglass, hygroscopic chemical-preventing misting. The rear wall of the pressure cabin was formed by an armored bulkhead, and the entry hatch in the starboard side floor could be opened in an emergency by compressed air. The FA tail turret was aimed by means of a PVE-11 double periscopic sight, and its field of fire was plus and minus 60 degrees azimuth and plus or minus 45 degrees elevation and depression. Its twin vertically disposed 30mm MG131 machine guns were provided with 300 RPG, but delays in the perfection of this turret and its control system affected the Ju-388J in a similar fashion to other aircraft intended to mount this equipment, and production orders for the initial model, the Ju-388J1, were amended to permit delivery without the remotely controlled armament. The Ju-388V4 and V5, the second and third prototypes of the J-series Zastora, being delivered without the FA-15. These prototypes differed from the Ju-388V2 in several other respects. A Schrag Music arrangement of two 20mm MG151 cannons with 200 RPG was introduced in the aft fuselage. These weapons, firing obliquely, were upward at an angle of 70 degrees from the horizontal, and the Liechtenstein SN2 and its Hirschgeweih aerial array was replaced by FUG-218 Neptune with a pointed wooden nose cone enclosing much of the Morgenstern type antenna. FUG-350 Naxos Z being built into the Morgenstern compartment to receive H2S emissions. An addition tail warning antenna was provided, and other avionic equipment included FUG-10HF, FUG-16ZY VHF radio, FUG-25A IFF, FUG-101A radio altimeter, PEGE-6 radio compass, FUBI-2 airfield blind approach receiver, and FUG-120A Bernardine beacon bearing recorder. All three prototypes were powered by the turbo-supercharged BMW 801TJ air-cooled radial engine operating a combat rating of 1,410 horsepower, plus 136 pounds, residual thrust at 40,300 foot. As was also the initial production version, the Ju-388J1, which carried similar equipment to that of the V4 and V5, production deliveries of the Ju-388J1 were scheduled to commence in January 1945, and in the event, none was to leave the assembly line as the war situation dictated the halting of production in the previous month. At that time, it had been anticipated that the Ju-388J1 would be succeeded on the assembly line by the J2 in March of 1945, this differing from the first model solely in having the periscopic sights and remotely controlled tail barbette reinstated. Production of the J3 was expected to be initiated simultaneously, this differing primarily in having UMO 213E1 liquid-cooled engines with methanol water injection. Two 33 Imperial gallon MW50 tanks were to be built into the wings, and provision was to be made for a 160 Imperial gallon drop tank. A projected development, for which no production plans were formulated, was the J4, with a so-called Waffenvan, or weapon tub, centrally mounted beneath the fuselage and housing two forward-firing 50mm Mk114 cannons. Only 2 weeks before production of the Junkers fighter was halted, the minutes of a General Luftzeugmeister Amt conference held on the November 22, 1944, recorded a decision to persevere with the Ju-388J development and to accelerate development of the DB603F to replace both the BMW 801TJ and the UMO 213E1, although it was not anticipated that this engine, a development of the DB603A with large supercharger and MW50 boosting takeoff power to 2,400 horsepower, would be available for installation until the second half of 1945. So a little bit of wishful thinking there. And now we go on to the final one, the Ju-388K series. Now, the Ju-388 V3, the prototype for the Ju-388K high-altitude bomber, appeared virtually simultaneously with the first Zastora prototype in January of 1944, and was fitted with the wooden ventral panner applied to the Ju-388L1. this enabling a maximum bomb load of 6,610 pounds to be carried for shorter range missions, although a more normal bomb load consisted of a single 4,409 pound bomb or a pair of 2,205 pound bombs. For defense, the Ju-388K was intended to rely entirely on the FA-15 tail barbette coupled with its high performance, although the barbette was not available for installation on the V3 or the 10 pre-production K0 bombers, which began to leave Dessau in July 1944. Like the L1, the K0 was powered by the BMW 801TJ, and it was intended to replace the engine by the BMW 801TM in the production Ju-388K1. This having a modified low supercharger gear and ratings of 1880 horsepower for takeoff and 1820 horsepower at 33,400 feet. However, in the event, the 5 K1 bombers completed retained the BMW 801TJ, although the FA-15 barbette was also fitted. Plans existed for 2 further versions of the bomber, the K2 with the UMO 213E1 engines and the K3 with the UMO 22EF engines, but neither variant has been flight tested when all further production terminated early in 1945. Yet another variant of the Ju-388M1, which, with a crew of 4 and lacking the ventral pannier, was intended as a carrier for winged torpedoes. Pre-production examples of the M were under construction when the entire program was cancelled. With the Ju-388, the basic Ju-88 design of the 1936 had been carried to its ultimate development, and there can be little doubt that had the Luftwaffe succeeded in bringing to operational service in quantity this final derivative of Juncker's Schnellbomber, the remarkable performance that it offered would have posed serious problems for the Allies. As it was, apart from a few sorties by the Reconnaissance model, the Ju-388 failed to see combat. So, as you can see, the 388 was seen as a wonderful machine that was kind of annihilated before it really got off the ground. And this is a common story with a lot of machines when it comes to the Luftwaffe in 1944 and 45, where they weren't able to make enough of them, they didn't have the resources, and also they didn't have the fuel. But it seems like a lot of people put a lot of faith in this 388, and they just could not make them fast enough. Now, talking about different versions, as we saw with the dev blog, that we are going to get the 388J, and as shown here, there are multiple versions of the 388J that we could get in game, and that means that if one is picked for the whichever one is picked for the one which becomes a premium, you can easily make another one a standard tech tree vehicle. There is also plans for a bomber in there, which was built and was delivered, and also the Reconnaissance one. But the issue with the Reconnaissance one is obviously no bomb load, no offensive armaments, only the defensive guns on the back. So I think if we are looking at standard tech tree equivalents, you either pick another variant of the J or the V2, which was the prototype for the J, or you pick a K version, which has, the bomb load on it. I think we stay away from the torpedo one, since it was never built, and also the ones with the crazy engines, since, of course, they were never properly flight tested. Anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd like to thank B. Young, Blackie, Dyslexic Child, Moxie, Olo Brolo, Martinez, and Super Cacti for supporting me on Patreon.